I know that when a lot of you signed up for this course, you wanted to learn about animals. And when we've been learning about it for the last month, have not been what you were thinking about. You were not thinking about the cnidarians and the flatworms and the mollusks. You were most likely thinking about the scaly, the feathery, the furry animals that we all love so much. Today is the day that we get there. So we've covered 9 phyla. We've got 1 left. And the one we have left is generally referred to as the vertebrates, or all the things you go and learn about when you're a kid in the zoo. Not everybody in our last phylum, though, is a vertebrate. Our last phylum name is Chordata, or the chordates. Most of what we know is most of the organisms in there are vertebrates, but there are a couple of that aren't. So let's talk about the phylum as a whole. So, chordates all share 4 essential characteristics. The first is that the most notable and the most distinguishable is the notochord. The notochord is the precursor to the backbone. So the notochord is a support rod that runs through the organism. In vertebrates, this developed into the vertebrae. Additionally, all chordates have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. So when we've been dissecting things, most of the nerve cords, in fact all of them we found, have run on the ventral surface or the belly surface of the organism. We have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. In other words, we have a spinal cord that runs along our backside. We also have a shared digestive respiratory structure known as pharyngeal pouches. It's kind of like gills. In some organisms, they develop into gills. In others, it develops into things like our esophagus, our throat, and other respiratory structures. And finally, for movement, we all have a post-anal tail. So if you've noticed, everything else that we've studied, for example, the flatworm, the tail was at the very bottom. The anus was at the tip of it. The earthworm, the anus is at the tip. We have a post-anal tail. So if you picture, say, a dog, the dog's anus is here and the tail continues onward. That actually is a great evolutionary adaptation that allows for increased stability in movement. There are 3 classes of chordates. The first we'll discuss is called Urochordata tunicates. An example would be a sea squirt. They look like that, and you're probably thinking, boy, that looks more like a sponge than it does a person. And you'd be right. However, what we notice about them is they have the 4 chordate characteristics as larvae, so they count as a chordate. The next one is Cephalochordata. Hopefully you go, oh, cephala! That means head. These are the lancelets. They have a head. And they have the chordate features as adults, but they stay the chordate features. They stay, for example, pharyngeal pouch and notochord. They don't develop into anything else. Finally, we are members of the class Vertebrata. Some call it a subphylum. And we're the vertebrates. We have the chordate features as larvae, but typically they develop into other structures like bones as adults. So let's talk vertebrates, because that's, my thing. So first off, before we get into it, there's a couple of vocabulary terms you need to know. Hopefully you're familiar with them. The first one is thermoregulation, and that is how do the organisms maintain homeostasis of their body temperature. Recall that organisms need to maintain homeostasis. Too much fluctuation and things like their proteins might denature. So the way they do that has basically 2 choices. Some organisms are ectotherm. In elementary school, you probably learned that as cold-blooded. And so their organisms are controlled by external factors, hence ecto. And so, for example, a lizard, if it gets too cold, will go and sun itself on a rock. That would be a classic ectotherm. So fish, amphibians, and reptiles are ectotherms. Endotherms regulate our temperature by internal processes. Essentially, if we get too cold, we increase our metabolism to produce more heat. So that would be the birds and the mammals. The downfall of that is because we can produce our own heat, we require significantly more food to consume. If you've ever had a pet reptile, you know that they don't eat very often. I once knew somebody whose snake hadn't eaten for 6 months, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Whereas, of course, mammals and birds have to eat on a regular basis. But the advantage is that we can live in areas where cold-blooded animals can't live because we can control our temperature. If we're too cold, we simply need to eat more to produce more heat. When talking about the evolution of vertebrates, it's important to note that vertebrates in general are significantly larger than any of the animals we've talked about. Obviously, there are exceptions. There are certainly crabs that are larger than mice. But in general, vertebrates are significantly larger. With that size comes another number of adaptations. One is an endoskeleton. Vertebrates have an endoskeleton that provides significantly more structure. Because we have that endoskeleton, we can have a larger support system without it collapsing on our body. We call it the exoskeleton that arthropods have. Limits the size because it gets too big and they won't be able to move that heavy skeleton on the outside of their bodies. In addition, another structural support system is the jaw. If you look at fish, for example, have tremendous diversity in their jaws, and their jaws basically allow us to eat a greater range of prey and take advantage of a greater diversity of habitats and food sources. Another evolutionary adaptation that allowed for the larger organisms is a skull. With the skull comes the protection of our very soft and delicate brain tissue, which allows us to be larger and smarter. Of course, size and smarts don't always have to correlate. A tree, for example, isn't smart, but having that skull does increase our ability to think and process information. And finally, vertebrates typically, when you compare the number of genes in their genome, typically have many more genes than many of the invertebrates. That leads to increased adaptations and a great number of greater diversity. So let's march through the classes. The first one are the fish. As I'm hoping you know, fish are aquatic vertebrates that have fins and scales and gills, generally. They don't all have fins, but fish are ectothermic, meaning they're cold-blooded. Their environment controls their temperature. They have a really cool feature called a swim bladder that controls their depth. Inside it's basically almost like a balloon. If they want to go higher in the water column, closer to the surface, they put more air into that swim bladder and they become more buoyant. If they want to sink deeper, they take some of the air out and they sink lower towards the bottom. Most fish also have fins. The fins aid not only in depth control, but steering and stability. So if you look at a fin, they have a number of paired fins. They're not swimming with all of those fins. A lot of them are simply for stability as they swim. They have a feature known as a lateral line system. The lateral line helps them detect vibrations in the water and changes in the water, and it's a means of increasing their senses. Of course, on land, we have other senses that we can take advantage of, such as sound and smell. It's a little bit more limited in the water, so the lateral line system helps them with that. As we look at this diagram of the internal anatomy of one type of fish, you'll notice the swim bladder, which is here. I'm not going to get into too much of the anatomy because you'll find most of this when we dissect our shark. But one thing you may notice is this structure here, which is the kidney. Kidney is a great adaptation for organisms to control their salt content, among other things. So in fish, some live in salt water, some live in fresh water, as you know. And so the regulation of that salt content and therefore osmosis is super important. Marine fish have to live in a much higher concentration, and so they have to control their osmosis because otherwise they would lose water to their environment. Whereas freshwater fish have to deal with higher concentration inside their bodies, and so they would become flooded, which is why you can't throw freshwater fish in salt water and vice versa. So their kidneys help control that function. As I'm sure you know, fish have gills. The way that a gill works, we've talked about a little bit already, and that is water passes in through the mouth, out through the gills, and as it does, it goes through very fine capillaries in the gills, and as the water goes over it, the water of the environment has a higher concentration of oxygen and a lower concentration of carbon dioxide, and so consequently, the material diffuses across the membrane in the appropriate direction to give the fish oxygen and to remove the carbon dioxide. Many fish have an operculum, which is the flap that covers the gills. For some types of fishes, the opening and closing of the operculum controls and aids in their respiration. So for some of them, having that open or closed determines whether or not they're able to get the oxygen to their blood vessels. Fish have a single loop heart, meaning that as their blood flows through their bodies, it makes just one loop. So it goes from the heart to the gills to the body and then back to the heart. We'll see later that more advanced organisms have a double loop system. There are several classes that we as humans consider fish. The first one is not a vertebrate at all. It's agnatha. It would be like the lampreys and the hagfish. They're super gross looking things there. They have snake-like bodies. They retain their notochord as adults, so there's no bones. They do have cartilage, though. They do have some cartilage. And many of them are filter feeders or scavengers. The hagfish are exceptionally gross. You touch them and they're just like covered in slime. They have an open circulatory system. Recall, we saw that in other types of animals, and that is where a heart pumps the blood to keep it flowing, but the blood bathes it in an open cavity that oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood mix. The next class of fish are the cartilaginous fish, or the chondriichthyes. We'll learn a lot about these because we're going to have Shark Week when we dissect our shark. But a couple of cool points. First one is that they're cartilaginous because they don't have bones. They have cartilage, but they do have a full skeleton. Sharks tend to swim with back and forth motion, side to side, whereas you might be more familiar with like a dolphin that might go up and down. So they go back and forth, whereas the ray goes up and down more like a bird. We see that the ray here doing that. They have really cool scales that look kind of like this picture on the right. And we're finding all kinds of cool things we can do by mimicking the scales. So one thing they found is there's not a lot of bacteria that grows on shark skin. And so they've developed this technology called shark-like technology, and they're making products for hospitals in it because they don't have to use some of the really harmful antibiotics. The bacteria just doesn't grow on it. Additionally, they're using the same kind of technology to increase aero and hydrodynamics because the sharks are very, very hydrodynamic. There was one Olympics where everybody had crazy fast times because their swimsuits had that technology. I think it's since been banned. But so they have super cool scales. Our last group are these two that we see on the bottom, and they are the osteichthyes, or the bony fish. They are the fish that you're probably familiar with seeing. So they have scales. They have this swim bladder that I was mentioning. There are a couple different kinds of bony fishes. The lobed fin fish have thicker bones in their fins, and some of them have joints. Long fin fishes, I believe, have derived from lobed fin fishes, and it's thought that those are the ancestors of land animals, tetrapods. Ray fin fish are the kind that you're probably most familiar with seeing. Most of the fish that you've seen are the ray fin fish, the kind you catch, the kind that you see in aquariums. They have the really thin, fanned out bone structure in their fins, and have the really thin layer of skin on it. That's it for the fish. Our next video is going to be about the move to land. That's when the fun happens.